we thought we would start by giving you an update on what's going on with the working group and some future meetings. So we'll start off with that. Then we're going to jump into the status of the financial transparency requirement. And I know if you've been at all exposed to any news, that there's a lot going on with the regulations on the ESSA law, and it's sort of a minute-by-minute thing. So we'll give you the update. And then we're going to shift into office hours, where we have stacked some slides in here that may be of utility, but I think based on some calls that we had in the interim since our last call, some of you have a lot of questions in the queue. So we will try to just kind of work with you all to answer those questions, and all of you are welcome to stay on as long as needed to do that. So as far as where we are, you know, one of our things, we always have a meme. So Katie brought this one. I think it's perfect. Buffering, and we're back. So what happened was we had a contract from the Department of Ed to assemble this working group and help provide technical assistance to SEAs and LEAs as they met the financial transparency requirement. And the Department of Ed went through a very lengthy regulation writing process, and right before the end of the year wrote some regulations that included some with the financial transparency. Some of you will know that. And what happened and then they wrote some guidance, and we'll talk about that phase in a minute. And then with the new administration, the regulations got pulled and are no longer valid. So the word we got from the Department of Ed was stop technical assistance because these regulations are in limbo, and so we can't, as a Department of Ed, fund technical assistance related to regulations that don't exist. So we stopped, did a hard stop as we reached out to you all and canceled that next meeting. And what we heard from a lot of you all, and what our sense was, we still have to meet this requirement, and we are getting something out of working together on this. This is a group that doesn't interact with each other at these sort of financial leads at SEAs across the country anyway, and this working group still had value. So we talked to CCSSO and a few of our other funders about providing the resources to continue forward with this working group. And so we are continuing. We're still working on the funding part of that. CCSSO is helping, and we are marching forward to talk about this financial transparency requirement, but doing so very clearly without the Department of Ed support, because we can't be doing it in the name of the Department of Ed right now. So here we are. We're no longer funded by the Department of Ed. We're solely supported by CCSSO and funders that support the Edgenomics Lab at the moment. And so we have to give you our disclaimer that any opinions and guidance that are provided by us are based on our interpretation of the law, and they're not endorsed by the Department of Ed. And we have put some more meetings back on the calendar for the next 2 months. So we have today, we have March 28th, April 7th, April 20th, all from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So, and during those meetings, what we're still going to do are the things we've been doing, which is help you all move forward in meeting this requirement of the law by sharing examples from other states, as you dig into your data, trying to help you answer questions about your data, and so on. So that's what we're doing. We are able to march forward, and as long as you all think this is value, we welcome you to come. So that's where we are, and that's why we were buffering and reorganizing and jumping back into it. We are happy to take your feedback at any time, both in the chat box, if you want to raise your hand and say something throughout today. But even in between, you're always welcome to email one of us. Katie's much more quickly responsive than I am, but we are happy to try to make this working group useful to you. So if you have ideas about how it can be useful to you, surely let us know. All right, so now that we've regrouped, I thought we would spend a moment kind of recapping what happened with the financial transparency part of the ESSA law. And you may remember back they called it a Christmas miracle, that this bipartisan law was put forth to renew what had been No Child Left Behind, or ESEA, and now called ESSA. And in that law, there was a line in the statute that requires SEAs to report expenditures by school. And that was signed into law, just a little over a year ago. And then what happened is the Department of Ed set out to do a lot of work to write regulations, and write regulations around a lot of things, not just this financial transparency, but regulations that were really quite controversial around, or got more attention anyway, around the accountability plans. And but before we get to the regulations, the law exists. It was signed, and it says that SEAs must comply in order to receive Title I funds. So that is there. It's in the law. And then very late in 2016, in November 2016, the accountability regulations were released. And these had a lot of public input, and they had panels and hearings and things like that. And they're written by the Department of Ed, but they are considered mandatory. Regulations are considered mandatory. And that included, around financial transparency, a requirement for a uniform procedure. You remember we talked a lot about this, for attributing spending in LEAs. And it clarified what could and sort of couldn't be excluded. And it said that there was also an extension to the deadline, and that while the law said you had to report this by December the following year, this extended it till later. And then it defined things like the student count. And that was released in November 2016. And so those were considered mandatory. And shortly after that, something else was released called guidance. And guidance is not considered mandatory, but it's also written by the Department of Ed, and it offers up examples and clarifications. And there was quite a bit in there also around financial transparency. You may never really have seen much of this because that was published in January 2017. We made some mention of it in our discussions, but pretty quickly after that, the accountability regulations were pulled, and the process of withdrawing them was initiated in January. It's now passed both houses and both chambers, I guess I should say, and likely to be signed by the president this week, which means the regulations are gone. And in there were things like we talked about, the numerator and the denominator of counting per pupil expenditures, what was a uniform procedure, and so on. And because the regulations got pulled, as soon as that process started, the Department of Ed quickly pulled the guidance that came. And that's no longer being disseminated, but that had some of the examples of how all of this would work. And so the Department of Ed withdrew the guidance immediately when the regs were pulled. And so what we're still left with is the law. And the law is a pretty simple statement that we'll talk about in a minute. What we did here last week was that the Department of Ed would be issuing new guidance. And I'm telling you that the financial stuff is kind of small potatoes compared to what everybody's thinking about with these accountability and state plans. But the Department of Ed said, we'll issue some new guidance, much simpler, that will make sure states to stay on their plan to release their accountability plans this year. And that new guidance, we thought, may or may not include anything about financial transparency. So they said it will be released this week, and sure enough, this morning, some guidance was released on the state plans with no mention of the financial transparency. So it's possible that we will have a little bit more guidance come out on financial transparency, but it's also likely that we won't. So that's where we are, and that's when you hear things like the statute or the law, which is that first bucket. Then there's regulations, and then you have guidance. The law is still the law, and so we will march forward. Any questions so far? I'm going to have a little bit more on this before we jump back out. Okay.
There's one question from Eleanor, so hold on, we'll unmute you, Eleanor.
Hi, thank you for that overview, very helpful. I was wondering if you could humor us and maybe tell us a little bit more about how this piece links with all the other accountability pieces. As you can imagine, there's the organization here in Boston's a bit of buzz with that piece, and I'd like to be able to better understand that piece and how the financial part links to the student accountability part.
Well, I won't do a very good job of it, and partly that's because I was off the face of the earth for 3 days last week with a medical emergency. So I'm not really going to be the right authority, but I will ask Katie to chime in if she knows any more. I do know that the states have to come up with their accountability plans, and I think most of them are going to wait till later this school year. They're 2 date or later this year. 2 dates, an April date and a later one, and there was a lot in the accountability regulations about how states should go about preparing those plans, and I think the buzz from Washington D.C. was that the new administration felt like there was too much of a heavy-handed Department of Ed role in that, and really wanted to pull it back and let states figure it out themselves. I don't think that the conversations around the accountability regulations are at all that people are really thinking about the finance one as part of that. I think this is like a tag-along area at the end, and they're not so much interrelated at all, but they're just sort of got bundled together. And from what I understood, the financial transparency requirement could have actually, the regulations for that could have actually been released separately, but because they got bundled with the accountability regulations, they got pulled as the accountability regulations got pulled, not because they were particularly related. So so that's what I know. And Katie, I don't know if you have any more insight, or Eleanor, maybe you have more insight you could share with the group.
Yeah, this is Katie. So I think the difference here is that the state plan is not necessarily the report card plan, even though a lot of the elements in the state plan will end up on the state report card, and the financial transparency component is a requirement for the state report card. So, but the Department of Ed isn't requiring states to submit like sample report cards or any of that kind of stuff. It's just around the different titles in the law. So yeah, financial transparency is not included in the state plan that has to be submitted this year.
Great. We actually have another comment here from North Dakota. North Dakota is planning on adding Fitwig to their state ESSA plan in April, and will that be okay? And just want to see whether or not you have any concerns or thoughts on that, Marguerite.
We think that's just a great idea. I know, and I do think this is why we kind of hustled to get this group back up and running, is from what we heard from people is that there was a lot of learning shared, not only on this financial transparency, but on just other kind of details among a group in SEAs that hadn't had access to an opportunity to partner across SEAs. And if the new model is that states should kind of figure this stuff out and learn from each other, groups like this, Fitwig, are ones that will foster that kind of learning and discovery and sort of professional development. So that is good news to us. All right, great. Well, let's keep marching forward here then. Or do we? It looks like
we do have one more question.
Okay.
I think from Deb Vespa. So I'll unmute you, Deb. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, I was just wondering. So in a nutshell, because what I'm hearing is the timelines that we have to report this is on the report card that's coming out. So what I'm hearing you say, though, that it's not by the per student cost that has to be on the report card, it's the other thing. So what's the timelines that states have to be reporting for the per pupil expenditures, basically? Is it fiscal year 17 or fiscal year 18 data? And have you heard anything further about filing a waiver for an extension?
Yeah, so here, I'll move to the next page here. Wait, let's see if I, let me hold on that for a second, and then we'll go forward. Because the date is a big part of this whole thing. So what is in the law? The law still stands, right? This is what we have. The requirement says that SEAs must report the per pupil expenditures of federal, state, and local funds, including the actual personnel expenditures and actual non-personnel expenditures of federal, state, and local funds, disaggregated by source of funds for each LEA and each school in the state for the preceding year. The deadline there is December 2018 for the 2017-18 school year. And you're absolutely right. One of the things that was in the regulation was a possible extension. Well, there was an extension both of the annual timeline, but also like a possibility to get a waiver for the first year. So we, unless the Department of Ed releases something again saying that we've added this waiver in there or extended the deadline, those extensions are now gone, and these deadlines hold. So a couple of things I want to point out here about this. So that would mean that in December 2018, you would have to report the per pupil expenditures for the 2017-18 school year. And wearing my practicality hat, I don't necessarily think you have to do a great job of it the first year. So I think, something tells me that this administration isn't going to be heavy-handed on the compliance side of this whole thing. And given that there was an extension, the extension got pulled, but they do want states to be figuring this out and they want less federal intervention, I think that, it seems to me like a good faith effort would go a long way. But that's, again, just me talking. So let me just outline a few of the other changes here. So what's changed by pulling the regs and the guidance? The date is the big one. So you're absolutely right, Deb, about that. There's no extension at present. That means December 2018 is the date for the school year that starts this September. And it also vastly increases the choice by states on how and what to report. So the regulations about a uniform procedure are gone. So that language doesn't exist anymore. And remember, the uniform procedure was going to try to make sure that all districts were doing similar reporting in a state and things like that. The definitions of numerator and denominator, sort of what counted as an expenditure in the numerator and what counted as a student, those are gone, including like how do we count students. Remember, there was a one-time count on or about October something. That is gone. Any student who is receiving publicly funded preschool counted, that kind of thing is gone. So that means there's more discretion in states to do it the way that maybe you've been doing it, whatever that is. The fewer changes are required here. And another note, though, is that the requirement for real salaries remains in the law. So it says the real expenditures. There was one other item worth noting, was that the original law said you had to disaggregate by source of funds. And remember, there's federal, state, and local. But pretty quickly after the law was written, people realized you can't disaggregate inside districts by state and local money. But people have said the way to interpret that we've heard, and we've actually even heard this from some legal counsel, is that state and local can be one category still. That was made clear in the regulations, but disaggregating meant disaggregating federal separately from state and local. So my understanding is the interpretation of the way the law is written will continue to be allow you to just report expenditures in two groupings, federal, and then the second grouping being state and local. So you're right on the requirement there. Any other questions on this or comments? Okay. So what we would point out then is that the productivity opportunity remains. And when we said this kind of at the beginning when we launched the FitWig, was that there is an opportunity for states to go beyond compliance and build a financial transparency system that works to drive system improvement in your state. And it seems that now, in the absence of these more lengthy regulations, that the opportunity is even more clear, that you can do what works for you and do what works for you to drive system improvement in your state. And 4 things we'll note here is, first of all, the school is an important unit in the education system, and we've known that for a long time. So this will allow us to couple spending with the outcomes that we've had for some time at every school level. And by doing that, we can co-locate that, spending and outcomes, and drive kind of a focus on what's possible at every school with the resources that are available at that school. And as part of that, the second notion is that a data system like this can activate school level engagement. Maybe create an urgency for principals, help principals have the tools that they need to leverage their dollars to do the most for students. So the research actually suggests that a lot of school level behaviors play a big role in determining the relationship between spending and outcomes. So you can have 2 schools that spend the same amount of money, spend it in the same way with roughly the same mix of students, and still get different outcomes. But when each one of them sees their job as leveraging their resources to try to get the most for their students, and they can start to see what's possible in other schools, they may create a greater ownership and willingness to do the most with the resources they have. They might both have a librarian, but now the librarian is hustling to try to get kids to read as much as possible and sending books with them home on the vacations and weekends to try to drive up reading, seeing that role as part of the total expenditures put toward to achieving student outcomes. So there is an opportunity here. Third, the data system can help spread productivity enhancing innovations. So if we can start to see in data that connects spending and outcomes, that there are some schools that are really just killing it or off the charts, and they're all doing something a little bit different, maybe using some new innovation or some new way of serving students or a type of students, and it doesn't appear to be, appears to be financially feasible, then others can adopt that same thing or consider adopting it. So we want them to learn from each other at what's possible and at what cost. And lastly, there are, of course, equity implications that can come out of a financial transparency system, and that those help those inside school districts figure out which allocations are driving spending in different ways, and are they deliberate. They might say, yes, we're sticking with our allocations the way they are, but at least they've faced them and taken a look at them and made that decision. So sometimes, you might find that small schools cost a bit more, and school districts might take stock of that and say, well, in one hand, maybe it's not equitable, but on the other hand, the way our district is laid out, we think the best way to proceed is to still drive more funds to small schools. But they've looked at it and taken stock of it. What we find working with districts is sometimes there are patterns that no one sort of recognized or they didn't know emerge. And in that case, having those data in front of them can allow school board members and district leaders and budget writers to sort of say, is this what we want to do with our public funds? And that more intentional effort in the end becomes part of the productivity opportunity. So that was my productivity speech for today. I know I'm a little long-winded here, but I think I'm going to, at this point, stop there. We will start to unmute each of you, and I think you may have some questions or considerations for your own states. You can type them in the question box, or you can raise your hand. I think do we want to unmute everybody all at once? Or do we think that would be worrisome? Katie, what do you think?
I think it's fine. I think I just warning to everyone, you are going to be unmuted. So if you want to mute yourself on your end, that's probably a good idea. But it'll allow for an easier flow of conversation if we can have everybody unmuted at the same time, I think.
Great. Yeah, so if you want to have a big private conversation in the background, you may want to press mute on your side.
Hold on, they just unmuted.
Yeah, and there should be a mute, like a microphone symbol that you can mute or unmute on your end if you like. And I think we have a question from Dean Folkers. Katie, can you take a look?
Yeah, Dean says, where is the guidance available that was released this morning? So I actually saw it for the first time in an EdWeek article, but it is on a government website, so I can send that out through the question. I'll answer Dean's question and send that link out. And if that doesn't work, Dean, just let me know and I can email it to you.
It's only like 2 pages, right, Katie?
Yeah, well, it's actually, it's a Word document, and I think it's like 5 or 6 pages, but it's much shorter than the Obama template was.
Another question here from Amy. Oh gosh. Amy, go ahead. Okay, that wasn't working. So I apologize, Amy. Your question got lost in the system. If you could resend, that would be great.
And I see that Amy asked, can you share your slides with us? I absolutely will. No problem. We have as you all may remember, some more slides in this deck that are a little bit older ones, and we can send them out. We also record these webinars. Do we record the office hours?
We are recording this session of office hours, and we will also have the slides and the recording available on the web page that we have working just for this working group. So we will send out that link and login detail to everyone following this call, as well as the link to the information that was released this morning that Katie was talking about.
And in this slide deck, we have some of the examples that we've gone over in the past about how spending might vary, what's captured at the school level, what's captured at the LEA level, and how, depending on what you report, you'll have different implications for. And the sort of grouping of the of the different states under different types of data structures. And so if you're new to this group, you'll probably want to take a look at those and maybe catch up on some of the old webinars to figure out what data set you do have and how close you are to meeting those requirements. So I hope you all haven't just stopped working on this. I think we still think this is a really great opportunity. For instance, in the example data that you see here, being able to see that different schools might spend different amounts, but then they can reach out to in a statewide data system and start comparing themselves to other similar schools with similar student populations. Examining their spending is an opportunity. So there's, I think we got a little background, but we might mute whoever that is. But the idea here is that in such a data system, and some of you might remember that at the meeting in DC, we shared a scatter plot that coupled the spending data with the performance data at every school and allowed you to filter and drill down into subsets of the data for individual schools to search across other schools that spend the same amount they do, and get different outcomes and learn what they're doing and how they're spending their money.
Marguerite?
Yes.
This is Cindy in Rhode Island.
Hi.
So the uniform procedure then is no longer part of this, I think I heard you say.
That's right.
Which means as everyone goes and begins to define this, and the typical folks who look at data are going to look across states rather than just within your own state. There's not going to be any rhyme or reason without a uniform procedure as they start to compare numbers. And it's just going to, lead to more confusion, I think, out there. Is it the goal of this group to hopefully still come up with a uniform procedure? Even if it's voluntary?
There's 2 ways to look at that. Under the old regulations, the uniform procedure in one state did not need to match the uniform procedure in another state. So there was still this question of whether or not you were going to be able to compare spending. Now there was enough meat on that regulation that probably there'd be some comparisons in there. Like things were pretty consistent about, you've got to include transportation, you've got to include, you know, building operations, you can't start leaving money out of your spending comparison. And that seemed to ensure that whatever that was reported there at least captured enough of the money that you could start comparing it. But I think you're right that one of the greatest opportunities in this data is to be able to look across large swaths of the data and explore and drill down and benchmark and strive to do better and things like that. And that means that if you're a rural district in North Dakota, you might want to know what rural districts in Ohio and in Nebraska are also doing, or rural schools. And maybe somewhere out there are schools that match your demographics and have figured something out that you can learn from. So what we believe, and I'm glad you brought this question up, Cindy, is that getting to some kind of grand total for every school that shows both the school level and the LEA share of the money for some sort of grand total, like in the picture here that you can see that bottom row, that number is going to be the most comparable number. And then any other numbers that you can add in there and potentially share, maybe a breakout by special education or a breakout by transportation or things like that, are things that would help individual schools, as they're digging through the data, learn about what their peers are doing. And so I think, you know, more meat on the bone, I think, is a really great opportunity, but at a minimum, that bottom number there really matters. So how each school and district split what's at the school level and what's at the LEA level may not end up being consistent, but that may not have to be consistent. For instance, in this picture that I've shown you, the charter school doesn't have an LEA level, right? So they put all their money at the school, but they do have a grand total that we could compare to the grand total of other places. And if the charter school is, you know, getting lackluster results or super stellar results, what we can do is to say, are there things in there we should be looking at, given that they're at least in this particular one, their spending levels are a little bit lower. But I think that as long as you have the big number here, this bottom number for every school, then you'll have this state comparability, and then it won't be perfect after that. I do think that if states on this Fitwit group want to try to learn from each other, you know, Rhode Island's an example of one with a very rich accounting system, that a chart of accounts that has a very specific set of rules around what gets allocated to which category, and there's really a lot to learn from that. You can wholesale adopt one of these models that's from Mississippi or Rhode Island or one of these other ones that has a lot of a very advanced chart of accounts. And if you're not there yet, you might choose to wait and say, well, we're going to start by just getting our big number and seeing what we can do. And how do the rest of you think about that? Do you feel like having a kind of this more comparability across states is going to be of value?
This is Jay Sullivan from Massachusetts. I believe that anytime we can compare ourselves to other states, I think that's helpful information in terms of things like benchmarking and what have you. But the problem, as you stated it so correctly, is not knowing how those calculations are being made on a state-by-state basis. It's like could make it an apples to oranges comparison.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if one state excludes transportation and another state leaves it in, the first one is going to look, you know, less expensive, but they may not be. And so their schools might look like an exemplar of leveraging a small amount of money to get great outcomes. And so I do think that if you want to develop a system that's useful, you really do want to try to put as much money in there as possible. And I think what we could do, you know, maybe even at the next Fitwig meeting, is to come up with a list of common things that states have had, some urgency about excluding. Food service is one that's sort of tricky, and I can explain why. Preschool is one that's been sort of tricky, and we could, as a group, say these are ones that we that most people want to leave in, and these are ones that most people want to leave out. And that way you could say, well, I don't have to go with what the group says. I know that my data will be more comparable if I adopt some sort of procedure that looks at least somewhat similar to other states. The other thing I think that any state can do is, even if you don't have complete similarity, the more breakout you add, like I think if you add like more rows here for what's the breakout of special ed, and what's the breakout of transportation, and what's the breakout of things like that, you might find maybe benefits is one that I think will vary a lot across states, is that you'll be able to drill down into other ones, even if they have different categories than yours, and see right away, like the school's actually not great comparison for us because it doesn't have any students with disabilities, and I was kind of looking across schools that try to have more students with disabilities or higher expenditures for disabilities. Or here's a rural school and it seems really expensive, but it's mostly wrapped up in 2 or 3 kids with really high disabilities costs. So once I take out the disabilities costs, the school spending is much more on par with peers. So where you can add additional categories like that you think the users will want to know, I think the better value.
Yeah. Again, just Jay Sullivan from Massachusetts, just to comment on that. One of the problems that we're having here from a state perspective is we don't have a good way of breaking out things like transportation costs on a school-by-school basis. So that's problematic, even though in the grand scheme of things, I don't consider that to be a material cost of providing education. It is in some areas, but not in most.
No, I agree with you. And I think on this picture that we have here, you could put the transportation in the LEA level, right? But at least if at some schools they want it in the school level, or it's able to be put in the school level, fine. If some it's in the LEA level, that's fine too. We just know that the money exists. So I don't think everything has to be parsed by school in order for the data to be valuable. But if some things are missing entirely, then it will distort the spending comparisons. So I think you're right. Transportation, plenty of things might make most sense in the LEA level. And then what we've seen from individual schools is that when a school sees what their share of the LEA level expenditures are, they also create a better appetite to use those monies thoughtfully. So I'll just use the transportation as a funny example. But a school might say, we're spending $800 a student on transportation, and we've had a lot of problems with transportation this year, or most of our kids that we think could get a $200 bus pass, and that we could drive that number way down. And whether or not the district has some other reason for sticking with the way it is, having more eyes on that money, even if it's a group expense, is still a good thing. So I think that's okay if it's not broken out, but it's still there as part of the total expenditure for each school.
Thanks.
So I think that's good. And I think there's going to be a lot of variation in that across states. So we have another comment, I think. We most say we do think it's a good idea to have, I think it's Michael said, we will need to be able to compare among states who decide not to have uniform procedures. Well, the problem was the uniform procedure was really supposed to only be uniform in a single state. So it still meant we could have 50 different uniform procedures. So in some ways now, it may be the case that if there is interest in this group, or even in a set of states, that we could come up with a set of financial expenditure reporting standards. Maybe that allows for some room in some areas, but says at a minimum, in order for the data to be comparable, it needs to do X, Y, and Z. And if that's something this group puts together, I'd be happy to take that back to our funders and say, let us work on that together with this group and see if we can come up with some financial reporting standards that that work, that allow for this across state comparison.
I do think that makes a lot of sense, Marguerite, because whether we want it to happen or not, the data is going to be compared state to state and school to school. So at least if we have some common ground, whether we like where its placement is or not, you know, we can have an explanation on there that says where things are.
Yes,
and it's not just because we decided.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's the truth. Is you can imagine that some parent's going to walk into the principal and say, I just went online and here's a school in Vermont that spends a third of what we have, and they have a hockey team. Can I have a hockey team too? Where's all the money going, right? And if we're looking at apples and oranges, then that system, you know, it's going to be used in lots of different ways anyway. We might as well put out really valuable data out there that has enough nuance in it and captures enough thing that you can say, well, actually, the school in Vermont, you know, if you look at the full picture here, there's still a lot of money at the LEA level that you didn't consider. So they're not spending a third of what we're spending, and their benefits rates are lower, and this, that, and the other. So that's where we can start to make actual comparisons. It doesn't mean that we have all this money that's freed up. But that's a very good point. Whether it's not our, maybe not be our fault that the numbers won't compare, but it will be our problem, right? So we might address that problem and head it off by building some smart financial systems that provide good data that can be compared. And maybe there's something, I'm thinking out loud here, like some sort of gold seal that says these financial data can be compared with financial data from other states that have met the same basic standards.
Another comment from Michael. He liked Stevens, the SLFS model. Thought it was the lowest common denominator that all states could meet. I'm going to unmute you, Michael. I'm not sure. Hopefully you got that.
That's a good point, and that's a really great place to start, because whether you have an advanced a chart of accounts system or not, even the states without an advanced chart of account system can start with the SLFS data capture strategy, and that one has been through several pilot rounds. So they're learning about what's doable and what's not, and that might be the basis for where we start to develop some, you know, some financial data standards for financial school level financial reporting. I like that idea. Oh, and Michael doesn't have a microphone, so that's good. You're very helpful. That's a great idea, and maybe we can bring that out. Are there other even individual state questions that you have? You're welcome to put them forth for the group, or are there other concerns or questions or ideas for future meeting topics? We figured this would be a little bit of a catch-all, a little bit of a placeholder, just to get us back going and thinking about this requirement again. But I'm not sure if any of you have been doing some things in the last 3 weeks that you even maybe want to share. Well, if you're, feel free to jump in and cut me off, but I'll just go ahead and tell you where we were when we left off. We said that as states were moving from a data inventory into action, that we had 4 sort of buckets. The first bucket were the SEAs that already had a common chart of accounts with a field for location, and those ones, you can see the names of them there on the left, and the best patterns there, the best option to move forward was to go ahead and start looking at what share of the finances were actually coded to the school level, what % were central, decide if any work needed to be done to dictate how districts divvy up central expenditures, and if so, who will do it. weigh in with your LEAs. I think we think that's a really critical step, and we do have some LEAs on the phone that they're the ones that sort of are going to be able to give you a sense of whether or not asking them to account for their data in a particular way interrupts something that they're doing or is practical. Identify any equity issues that you know might be surfaced before the numbers are released. Start to look at some visualization options and develop a communication plan. So number two, there's the SEAs that have SLFS or similar data by school. And here again, it's some of the same steps. You start with some early data runs, connect with your LEAs, and sort of proceed on exploring your data, pulling it out by school, and seeing what it means. And I think that group is not huge here, but I think that some of the states from group 3 or 4 may either choose to proceed with developing a chart of accounts and going the route of group 1, or proceed with maybe a more modest strategy, which is start to collect SLFS data. And we've asked that if any of you have SLFS data sets, it would be great if you could share them with us. In fact, we can bring some analysis of those SLFS data sets back to the group. The IES that's been collecting those cannot, or NCES I guess it is, cannot, or somehow by regulation, share them directly with us. So they've told us, ask the states, they are allowed to share them directly with you. So if you can send us the SLFS data sets that you have, that would be a great way for us to start kind of digging in and highlighting any issues that we might want to pull together for our data standards. And then in bucket 3, there are SEAs with real salaries or benefits. That's also a place to start. Sorry, and then the last one.
I was going to say really quick, as long as we're on bucket 3, Deb with Illinois had raised her hand and curious if you had a question at this point that we could address.
I was just going back to the revenue, state, local, federal, and I was thinking at a time where the fees and donations and foundations and that had to be pulled out and not reported, basically. Was that rules or regulations, or was that statute?
That's a good point. It was in the regulations very clearly that that private money should be excluded, but the law says disaggregated by source of funds, and I think you couldn't ever commingle them with like state and local. So you could probably report them, but you would have to put them in a separate bucket. Okay. So I'm not sure if it helps. It helps at all, really. I think the law still says, you know, by the 3 public sources of funds, which means you can always add more data. Like you can always put the private money on there, and that's why food services was a really problematic one for a lot of states, because kids pay for lunches sometimes, and that money sometimes gets put together with federal and state money for lunch, which then doesn't break out any further. So it may be the case, and I'm curious what you all think, that the best idea is to exclude or separate out food services from this whole thing. I know a lot of you were having, several of you were having trouble trying to subtract the money that was brought in from students for food services, or to, and sometimes school districts make money on food services, so that's been a tricky area for people. Anyway, we have we've got there's a little checklist in here, and we'll send these slides out again. But it says if you're in each of those buckets, you know, you can kind of go back and forth and see where you are in the progress. And you know, as we mentioned before, really smart strategies to start by pulling whatever data you have and putting it in this chart. And the process of doing so will be really helpful for you. Anyone else with any updates from your state? Well, I think if that's it for today, we will stay on for a little while, and I think what might make sense for the next couple of meetings are to again share some examples from states so we get to know what each state is doing, but then maybe start to craft together some sort of list of financial data reporting standards and some sort of minimum standards that we think that states that are in all different positions on this could meet those standards, and including ones that use the SLFS data. So we will maybe start to develop a structure for proceeding with that. But if you have other ideas of what else would be helpful, let us know. We shared with you all at the DC meeting a visualization option that coupled spending with outcomes. And you can let us know whether more visualization options are useful or other kinds of things like that. But I think for this group, we will really like to take your lead. So if you have other ideas about what's useful, let us know. I think we will also be sharing out anything that we do get from the Department of Ed or the federal government with any clarification, including, the one we're watching really carefully is this deadline, because I think that matters a lot. But if we get any other insights, we'll send them out in an email update. Or Katie, do you want to also mention the blog and things like that?
Yeah, so the blog is still active, and you are welcome to chime in there as well. We'll include the link on the calendar invites to that and to the FitWig website, so you can get all the resources and stuff like that. But if you have any questions, I'm really responsive, so feel free to reach out and I can answer your questions. And it's also helpful to know if you have questions, other states probably do too. So just let us know if you have any feedback or questions. We'd really appreciate it.
And send us your SLFS data if you have it. That would be really helpful. Okay, well, thanks, everybody. We'll be on for a little longer if you have state-specific questions. And if not, thanks for coming, and we'll send out information on the next meeting soon.
Pat, I went ahead and unmuted you, so hopefully you're still there and can ask your question.
I am. Thank you, guys. Just wondering, I know that AEM had done some work through SLDS around data mapping on a wide variety of topics. I don't know if they've done a lot in financial resources, but I know that there's a whole bunch of new components in SEDS around alignment for financial data. And to this point of being able to begin the process of mapping and understanding data across states, that might be a good place to start.
That would be excellent. If you've seen anything on that, it would be great if you could point us to it. And who was it that you said did that?
AEM has the contract for SLDS grant components, Marguerite. So they've done a ton of, they were out doing a whole bunch of SEDS mapping to the SLDS data stores in a lot of states. I just don't know if they've done a whole lot in the way of financial mapping, but I do know that there's a whole slew of components that were identified as SEDS data components under financial resources and management.
Well, and I think that's a smart thing to look at, right? Because if we're going to do all this work around other data components like student counts and stuff like that, we don't want to come up with a whole new version of student counts that attaches to the financial data. That would just be a mistake. So I think that's a really good idea. So we'll take a look at that and see if that maybe there's just even some good ideas for how to start this work of developing, you know, a common set of procedures or a sign-on set of procedures around data reporting.
Yeah, it might very well be that what they've got just becomes sort of like a baseline to begin a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Thank you.
Yes.
All right, well, if that's it, everyone, I think I'm going to go ahead and sign off. So send us an email if you have any other questions or comments, and otherwise, thanks for coming.